Hello everyone, this is Jotto, and welcome to the Managrind tournament recap, talking about the top decks, talking about the top cards, and not the state of the metagame. Okay, so I'm cutting that from the intro because I'm doing the state of the metagame on articles for a while now on Hearthstone.com, so I kind of detracted it from the actual show itself. That's on the articles, you can check those out on Fridays, and it's also when the actual video goes up on Hearthstone. But anyway, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Top 3 from NA. We didn't get all 4 deck lists this time. In first place, we have Twisted. Second place, Tiandroy. And in third place, we have Managrind's own Reels. Now, first place, we had Twisted playing Warlock Watchers. Second time Warlock Watchers has won NA in a row, actually. Now, as usual, if there's multiple of the same deck, I'll just go over it once, and I'll go over any of the tech cards from when I come across it again. But anyway, Warlock Watchers. First things first, we have Alexstrasza and Lord Jaraxxus as sort of win conditions at the end. Karen Bloodhoof holds down the mid game along with Faceless Manipulator to copy some of the big stuff in your opponent's stuff, or maybe your own Alexstrasza or Karen. Then you have Leroy Jenkins as a finisher along with Power Overwhelming. As the rest of the spells, we have Siphon Soul, Mortal Coil to deal with sort of the big stuff and the small stuff relatively. Then we have Soulfire as free damage, even though it makes you discard, it's worth it for costing 0. Hellfire for the aggro decks, and Shadow Flame because you are playing the full Shields Up engine. Now, the Shields Up engine in Warlock Watchers, the full one, is Ancient Watcher along with Defender of Argus and Sunfear Protector. This is normal, but then we have 4 Giants and Twilight Drake, giving you huge mid-game presence and massive late-game explosive potential in the Molten Giants. It just allows the Shields Up engine to get that punch, which is really, really needed. Something that Shields Up engine has problems with is that it can't go on the offense, whereas the Warlock Watcher engine completely smashes that sort of prerequisite of being defensive on Watchers, because you play your Watchers to be defensive early, and then you just give your big stuff taunts and smash them over and over and over again until you win. Now, the last cards in the deck, we have Iron Beak Owl to get past some taunts, because you really want cheap stuff when you're life tapping. Life tap Iron Beak Owl costs 4 mana, kind of like Spellbreaker does, but then you drew a card on top of it, so you just want the Silencer Iron Beak Owl Superior in this kind of deck. And then we have Earthring Farseer to compensate for some of your life tapping, and also just to get you up a little bit. We have Alexstrasza, Lord Jaraxxus, Earthring Farseers, and Siphon Souls for healing, and it still has some issues with healing, but you really need to run a lot of different healing cards to keep yourself up. Now, on to the second place, we have Tiandroy playing Warlock Zoo. Now, random thing, why is this called Zoo? Like, I'm going to call it Zoo because that's what people know it as, but why is it called Zoo? It's an aggro deck, basically, but people have been calling this Zoo for a while now because there's a deck in Magic, which is super aggressive, called Zoo, but that's called Zoo because it plays mainly animals. So I don't know why this is called Zoo, but it's called Zoo, so we're going to move on. It's not as bad as Handlock, but anyway. As for the actual minions, this is more sort of mid-rangey aggro deck, is sort of the distinction there. We do have Defender of Argus to buff up some of your small stuff, along with Doomguard to finish out the game later. Then we have Knife Juggler to just get extra value off all your stuff. Young Priestess to buff up extra targets. Knife Juggler is an especially good follow-up to Young Priestess, by the way. You get your 3/3 Knife Juggler on turn 2. Pretty good. Then we have Abusive Sergeant to help get over taunts and get some extra damage in, along with Argent Squire to be buffed up. Direwolf Alpha, another one of those buffing things that works very, very well with Argent Squire. And even things like Defender of Argus, make him to a 3/3, make one of his buffs into sort of an extra one. They have some Knife Juggler that suddenly will become a 5/3 if it's been buffed. So that's a pretty big punch from just like a 3/2 at first. Then we have Harvest Golem for the easy trading, along with Flame Imp because it's an amazing 1-drop. Lepronome, another amazing 1-drop. Some extra punch in the early game is exactly what you need. Scarlet Crusader, essentially Harvest Golems, copy 3 and 4 if you think about it. They do pretty much the same thing. They do the same trading. Scarlet Crusader has higher attack, but is less efficient against removal spells. Then we have Shield Bearer because you can buff it up in your own deck. It doesn't, I mean, it has 0 attack, but it can still attack. Like, if you buff it, you can still attack with it. It's not locked into not attacking, which is some people seem to make the mistake on there. But you can actually attack with it, and it does come up in several games. Then we have Shadowed Sun Cleric, sort of a final buff. Been a while since Shadowed Sun Cleric has actually made some play. Used to be a metagame defining card in the past back when it was a 3-3. At a 3-2 though, it's still coming in, still seeing some play, and that's good to see. Lastly, we have Voidwalker, sort of the quintessential block all the things on a 1-drop. 1-3 for 1 with taunt is crazy. It makes Goldshire Footman really sad. And in classic Warlock action, we have just 2 Soulfires for the spells. You might even ignore the spells. Just life tap Soulfire for free. Spells don't cost anything. Pretty much every single card in this deck is live as a minion. It's what gives it its consistency, and it's why this is sort of more consistent, sort of the power overwhelming Soulfire combination that we're used to. Now, Reels is normally on here playing Rogue. That's kind of what he's known for. He plays Rogue a lot. He has been seen in Druid before, but he plays Rogue a lot and he makes Rogue work. He's played Miracle a few times. He's also played some of the mid-range decks, and he gets them to work, and that's sort of what he's known for. And then he comes out with a Mage deck. This also won the 2P tournament that happened on the next day, by the way. That was ridiculous. But he played Mage Control. Now, Mage Control has not really been doing well in Standard for a long time. But it's interesting to see that he's sort of bringing it back. Now, if we start off with the actual spells, we have Ice Block to block sort of... You can block and then Pyroblast, for example. Another deck that just has Pyroblast in it that we did not expect. Pyroblast has not been seen any place since it got nerfed. Pyroblast, however, still very, very good in a deck that's this slow tempo, lets you kill them from a 3rd life. Ice Block helps you get from turn 9 to 10 so you can Pyroblast, and that's sort of the major transition there. It also just helps you not die in general. Then we have Blizzard as basic AoE, also freezes all their stuff, very, very notable. Ice Barrier against the early aggro decks, along with Ice Lance. Since you're playing so much freeze, it can actually deal a lot of damage for 1 mana. 4 damage, 1 mana. Just ping, dead. It also works really, really well with Archmage Antonidas, which we're going to talk about later. Then we have Frost Nova, another freeze effect, along with Frostbolt. Basic removal can also be used to freeze for the Ice Lance. Mirror Image to hold off these early aggro decks. Arcane Intellect sort of set up your mid game and draws mid to late game. Get your win conditions. Make sure you get the card advantage flowing. 2 Fireballs for standard burn and also removal on really big stuff, along with a Polymorph to deal with anything. Basically the Tink Master of this deck. As for the actual minions, Nat Pagle still making play here. Nat Pagle got nerfed pretty severely, and he has been dropped from a lot of decks, but he's still seeing some play. I mean, in this kind of deck, he's really, really slow, but the deck itself is really, really slow, so the Nat Pagle might still get an activation or 2, and that's all it needs to do in this kind of deck. Then we have Blood Mage Thalnos for extra little spell damage, and the cantripping is pretty useful. Acolyte Ping, so you can draw 3 cards off it with your hero power if they ignore it. Mana Worm, amazing threat early, even in a control deck. Last stuff we have is Doomsayer, because you can go Doomsayer, freeze, and wipe his whole board. Kind of like an Equality Consecration that's delayed in that respect. And we have 2 win conditions. Alexstrasza, you can play Alexstrasza, target your opponent, and then Pyroblast next turn. They're basically dead if they take the hit from the Alexstrasza. And Archmage Antonidas, where you can go Archmage, Secret, get a Fireball. Or you can just go Archmage, Ice Lance, get a Fireball. And then you can play the Fireball next turn. And if he lives a turn, you just start chaining Fireballs. 8 mana, 12 damage to your face, okay. And that's why he's good. He's a 5/7, so he's really, really difficult to remove. Pretty cheap at 7 mana for a win condition. And if they don't have an answer to him, which they might not considering Tinkmaster got nerfed so severely, he doesn't like to big game hunter either. If they don't have an answer to this guy, he's going to win the game on his own. And that's pretty much a guarantee considering the amount of spells in this deck. Very, very interesting deck. Anyway, top 4 from EU. You Will Fall in first place. Then we have Delarium in second place. Saw him before. Then tied for third, we have Sharpie and Milithium. All these people have been on here before, I think, apart from UFO. Anyway, UFO was playing Warlock Watchers. Won both tournaments. This deck has become really, really good, actually. It's become really powerful. A lot of people are underestimating it, but I think it is one of the best decks in the format. Now, as for the actual tech cards in this one, pretty much everything was the same, apart from we have Shadow Bolt for earlier removal to deal with some of the large threats in the early game. Helps with Chillwind Yetis. But the major things this hits are like Azure Drake and Harvest Golem and just any of the 3-drops or anything buffed from Defender of Argus and things like that. Then we have Drain Life as sort of some additional healing, and it also lets you deal with things like Knife Juggler and some of the 1-drops very, very efficiently. You can Drain Life a Leper Gnome and you don't take any damage, which is fairly notable. And the only other techs we have in here are Ragnaros and Faceless. So Ragnaros, instead of Alexstrasza, Dies to Big Game Hunter, same as Alexstrasza, but you get some extra offense as opposed to some extra defense. That's the difference between those two cards. Ragnaros is a little bit faster as well. Then we have Faceless Manipulator because you have so many targets in your deck. You have 4 Giants, and then you have Twilight Drakes, even the Ragnaros. There's so many targets in this deck, so you can just run it yourself. Onto Delarium, we have Shaman OTK mid-range. Now, Shaman mid-range has made a couple splashes here and there, but OTK mid-range hasn't really. Now, the major difference here is that in standard Shaman mid-range, so we have Azure Drakes, Defender Vargas, and Gadgetzan to sort of hold down the mid-game in various ways. Manatite Totem also helps support his draw engine, since Nat Pagel is now gone. Argent Squire to hold down the early game and just make trading really awkward for the aggro decks, along with Unbound Elemental, sort of the class-specific Harvest Golem of the deck. Then we have Fire Elemental for efficient 2-for-1s on a creature late game. Flame Tongue Totem to help with your combos and also to make all your totems into 2 attack or 3 attack in the case of the 1/1. So that's sort of a solid creature lineup. And then for the actual spells, we've got Lightning Storm, Feral Spirits to deal with aggro decks, and Lightning Storm can also be used as burn against some of the larger creatures. Earthshock to deal with any annoying effects like Sylvanas, for example, and Cairn. Then we have Lightning Bolts, which are incredible in this deck considering you have a Gadgetzan as well, and they're just amazing in general. Then we have Hexes, because you don't have Tinkmaster anymore, you need to play both Hexes. Still one of the best cards Shaman has. One of the defining things of the deck is the fact that you can Hex anything you just can't deal with. And lastly, 2 Rockbiter weapons, which are used for the 2 OTK combos in the deck. Last minion being Blood Mage Thanos, which is used for things like Lightning Bolt and you can cantrip it. We've said before. Anyway, 2 OTK combos in this deck. Doomhammer with Rockbiter is 10 damage, and then you can do another 4 the next turn. And Alakir with Rockbiter is 12 damage, straight up, but it costs more. And they can both be tauntable, that's one of the problems with this combo. But then they don't need Wind Fury, which is the difference between playing this and Leroy Jenkins combo, which does 18 damage, but you need Wind Fury. That's the one difference, it's more reliable. You play both Alakir and Doomhammer, so you can get one of each, since one is better in one respect, the other is better in the other respect. Like Alakir, you can kill something straight up because he has 6 attack, and then attack straight through them as well because he has Divine Shield. It's pretty notable, and he also has Taunt, which can come in every so often. But most of the time when you play an Alakir or Doomhammer, your opponent dies. Now, this kind of combo has been played to great success in the past, especially by a player called Chaki, who sort of revolutionized the deck and actually made OTK kind of popular. And I do think that this is a very, very powerful variation on the deck. It just hasn't really been proven whether this variant is better or just the standard mid-range deck. We'll have to see in the future to see which one's sort of more consistent and better, but I think they're both viable at the moment. On to the 3rd place tie, starting with Sharpie, playing the obligatory Warrior Legendaries deck that always makes top 4s as a 1-off. Never 2, always 1. Kind of weird. Anyway. On to the sort of early game of the deck, we have Armor Smith along with Frothing Berserker, Acolyte of Pain, Cruel Taskmaster. This is the Enrage engine which holds down the early game, gives you a bit of punch in the Frothing Berserker, the threat they have to deal with. Armor Smith and Acolyte help set up your health to keep it high in the case of Armor Smith, and also Acolyte of Pain drawing you into extra cards. Cruel Taskmaster synergizes with all your Enrage cards fantastically. Then we have Gadgetzan Auctioneer to benefit off all the cheap spells. Speaking of spells, we have Brawl as your sort of mandatory AoE, can be very, very useful, especially if you just play a small creature in front of it. Shield Slam along with Shield Block to just deal huge amounts of damage for very, very, very small amounts of mana, and you get to cantrip your Shield Block. It's pretty nice. Then we have 2 Slams, cantrip, also synergizes really well with Gadgetzan, along with the Execute. So you go Slam, Execute, still a 1-for-1 because your Slam cantrips, and you just spent 3 mana to kill basically anything. Lastly, we have Whirlwind, which while clearing out small stuff on your opponent's side, also buffs up your Frothing Berserker, for example. You can get 5-6 triggers off this sometimes. Same with Armor Smith, Acolyte of Pain even draws a card. Then we have weapons, Gorehowl used with Alexstrasza as one of the win conditions, I'll get onto that later, and 1 War Axe. This is an interesting one. Most of the time you see 2, but 1 is all he needed in this particular case. It's a bit of a weird one. I think you'd have to test that one out to see whether 1 or 2 is better. It's interesting. Anyway, where does the actual deck get its name from? The legendaries. Random thing, Big Game Hunter, used basically to kill Ragnaros, and that's about it. Now, for the actual legendaries, we have huge amounts of win conditions in this one, even more than normal. Then we have Alexstrasza, which used with Gorehowl is basically a 2-turn kill. You go Alexstrasza, set his health to 15, Gorehowl, attack with both, and you basically kill them. Then we have Baron Geddon as sort of a pseudo win condition. They have to deal with them in some way, or he just keeps wiping their board over and over again. You can even pump up your Frothing Berserker. If you leave Frothing Berserker on the board with a Baron Geddon there, you're only going to get one swing in with your Frothing, but that's a lot of damage on top of your Baron Geddon attacking. Then we have Karen Bloodhoof to hold down the early to mid game. Groash is sort of a way of just ending the game out of nowhere, especially with Cruel Taskmaster for 12 damage out of nowhere. Then we have Ragnaros, another sort of pseudo charge card with 8 damage instead of the 12, but you don't need the combo. And then we have Sylvanas, an incredibly underrated legendary nowadays. I think Sylvanas is very, very powerful. It's not as powerful as it used to be, obvious, when it was 5 mana, but it's still very, very strong. Very, very underestimated. That effect is pretty crazy, especially if you narrow it down to just one creature on their board, and they have to give you it. It has some weird interactions with the Harvest Golem though, where if they kill it with a Harvest Golem, then they can't get the token. It's kind of weird. And lastly, we have Faceless Manipulator to copy your opponents, big legendaries, and obviously yours, because you're playing so many of them. Lastly, but certainly not least, we have Milithium. Failing on the names this week. Milithium playing Druid Beatdown. Now, for this week's Druid Beatdown variant, we are seeing Blood Mage Thalnos along with Nat Pagel still making an appearance in this deck because it's a little bit of a slower deck, so it can still be played. Cairn holds down the mid to late game in this kind of deck. In some, it holds down sort of the early-ish mid-game, in the case of the Warrior deck, because you're playing such a top-end curve, so the Cairn, you need it to sort of stabilize. In this deck, you just play it on turn 4 with Innervate, or you just run out on turn 6, and it's just a threat. So it really, really does set yourself up for the late game when you're playing some of your bigger stuff. Then we have Hoggar, which has been played a lot recently in these decks with Innervate, really coming into its own. You play it on turn 4 with Innervate, and it's crazy. Makes a token, it's only really vulnerable to swipe in terms of sort of hard removal, but the token is just there and it has to be dealt with against Zoo, for example. Innervate, token on turn 4, they probably can't kill it, so you just go token, and they have to soulfire it, otherwise it's just going to keep making tokens and then we'll lose the game. As for Cenarius, he's sort of the obligatory win condition in this kind of deck. He's the late game bomb that some of the decks play Ragnaros for, some play Ysera for. He's playing Cenarius in this case, because Cenarius doesn't get hit by big game hunter is a major thing versus Ragnaros, and against Ysera, he's kind of faster. He makes 2/2/2s which protect yourself and himself, or he makes your entire board huge, which is much, much faster than Ysera, and that's probably the reason why Cenarius is seeing a lot more play in Ysera. He also has one more attack, which is slightly notable. Lastly, we have Onyxia. Very interesting. Although Onyxia into Cenarius is good times, obviously. Onyxia is a 14/14 for 9, effectively, which is incredible, because you get your 8/8, and then you get 6 1/1s. If you have an empty board, it's 14 attack, 14 health. It's nuts. Again, vulnerable to swipe, same as Hoggar, but if they don't have it, or if they don't have like a Fan of Knives or something, he's just going to absolutely wreck the game, probably end the game on the next turn. As the rest stuff, we have Black Knight, because you don't have Tinkmaster anymore, you need to really rely on this Black Knight. Ancient Allure to draw you into your cards late game, so draw you into your win conditions in Cenarius and Onyxia. 2 big game hunters, not just 1, 2 because you need it instead of Tinkmaster. Basically, this deck was playing Black Knight, Tinkmaster, big game, now playing 2 big games because you can't play 2 Black Knights. Faceless Manipulator to copy your own big stuff. Also, Faceless Manipulator, big game hunter targeting Ragnaros is good times. Then we have Defender of Argus to buff up some of your small stuff. Speaking of some of the smaller stuff, Keeper of the Grove, obligatory silence, best silence in the game effectively. Earthenring Farseer, heal up your own minions against sort of control-y mid-rangey decks, or heal yourself up against aggro decks. Harvest Golem, anti-aggro technology, also pretty good against the mirror, just hard to remove. Against Druids, they can sort of Wrath hero power. Mages can Frostbolt hero power. There are ways of dealing with it, but it's still very, very irritating. They have to use the whole turn to do it. Then we have Chillwind Yeti. It's just a big 4-drop, very, very difficult to deal with traditionally. It doesn't die to most removal, like instead. He dies to Lava Burst and Hex and things. He dies to Shamans, but he doesn't really die to much else. He doesn't die to Swipe. He doesn't die to Eviscerate. Those are the big sort of damage-based removal spells that you'll see in the early game. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Druid of the Claw. As a 4/6 with Taunt for 5, he's a good 5-drop, which makes him pretty much obligatory in all of these decks. Simply because good 5-drops are so hard to get, so if you get one, you really want to play it. Especially if you innervate him out on turn 3, that's insane, getting a 4/6 with Taunt on turn 3. Anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me, come on Teamspeak. I do put the information in the description below. Anyway, this has been Jotto, signing off.